Is it a boy or a girl? Is that the first question you ask someone who's pregnant? Is sex and gender binary? Is gender a harmful social construct which typically promotes patriarchy, gender discrimination, and toxic masculinity? Why do we put people in boxes based on their sex? Let's dive into an honest conversation addressing these questions.
So people say blue is for boys, pink is for girls. So you must be a pink? No?
No.
Why?
Okay.
You are a girl, so you must be a pink, right?
I don't know how to answer this question. Are you a blue?
I like blue. I like pink. My favorite color is green.
Would you feel uncomfortable wearing pink?
Not really. In fact, I used to have a pink shirt.
What happened to it?
I don't know where it is.
I think a good answer to this question is how I came to terms with my gender identity. Okay. So at some point in my life, not very early on, but at some point in elementary school, middle school, I became infatuated with this idea of not being a girly girl, not being the stereotypical idea of Barbies, dolls, princesses, all that stuff.
Disney movies.
Yeah, those kind of things. I was like, ew, that's gross. I don't want to be a girly girl. I think it's called a tomboy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I was like, I'm going to go outside. I'm going to do sports and stuff. Mm-hmm. I'm going to play with cars and do Legos. I don't know. Because I always felt like with the idea of being a girl was associated with a negative connotation, being sensitive and dainty and all that thing. And I just didn't like that. So
even at that young age, you picked that from the society?
Yes.
That's interesting.
I became more inclined to be rather than just be comfortable with whatever I wanted to do, instead of just doing whatever I wanted to, I was I have to go against this. So I have to do the exact opposite of what a girl would want to do. I have to do what a guy would want to do. And then I would be do those sort of things. Even if I didn't if I didn't like them, I would still do them just because I just didn't want to associate myself with being a girly girl.
What made you go in opposition to a typical girl would do? Was that a way of rebelling against that stereotypical perception of how a girl should live?
Yeah, in a way, I guess it was rebelling, but it was more the way that media portrayed people reacting to girly girls. In movies, oftentimes if the antagonist is a girl, there would be a girly girl. For example, the movie Mean Girls, Regina George. I don't know if you've seen the movie, but she's a girly girl. She dresses up, she's super rich, and with those comes characteristics in which she's snotty and vain and those sort of things. And I just didn't like that. So I was these are the things being associated to these negative characteristics, and people don't like her. People just don't like who she is. So I cannot be associated to these characteristics, otherwise people will perceive me as this. And I don't want to be perceived in that manner.
You think these girly or this color symbolism to represent different genders, is it all culturally constructed?
Yeah, absolutely. I feel for sure. Because even when you first find out the sex of your baby, you have a gender reveal party, or the doctor's oh, it's a girl, it's a boy. And then you're at the hospital. When I was born, I got a pink blanket because I was assigned female at birth. So I was a girl. So it's definitely culturally constructed. The idea that pink was associated with femininity and being a girl, and blue is associated with boys.
We commercialized the whole gender color symbolism, right? We made books, baby announcements, birthday cards, birthday parties, gifts, clothing. Everything was color coded to represent a particular gender.
If you go into a baby aisle for clothes, it's insane. It's so gender oriented. It's for example, a lot of boys' clothing, baby boy clothing is centered around sports and dinosaurs, race cars, superheroes. And then if you look at girls' clothing, it'll be princess, frills, sparkles, unicorns.
It wasn't until after the Second World War that the modern convention, the pink for girls, blue for boys, started to dominate. And even so, it didn't really become mainstream until 1980s. So it wasn't that long ago, 40 plus years. I mean, there is nothing wrong in a person liking a particular color of clothing, a particular color of paint in their room. However, there are a lot of stereotypes emerged from that idea. Gender stereotypes. For example, culturally, we think that the men are not supposed to be showing their vulnerability because vulnerable men are seen as weak.
Yeah, vulnerable in the facet of sensitivity, like crying wise, emotional.
Yeah, and we say boys don't cry.
Yeah.
The gender that is typically identified as boys, they are under tremendous pressure to be more manly.
Like a manly man.
Yeah, to toughen up. And same thing with the women. If a woman talk about their kids at work, they are seen as distracted. However, if a man talk about their kids at work, they are seen as great dads.
I wanted to talk about the vulnerability thing real quick. So it's obviously different for girls and boys. Boys we've already kind of addressed. Like if you show a sign of you being emotional, oh, you're weak. Like toughen up. And then for women, it's like acceptable for women to be emotional, but it's often written off as hysteria or being not fit for like a workplace. So if you do show emotions, you're like, it's like written off as, oh, she's just being hormonal. Like she's just being overly sensitive.
Yeah.
And then it just becomes negative in either way.
If men are assertive, they are perceived as confident. While a woman, if they are assertive, they are labeled as bossy. Mm-hmm. It might seem very harmless. However, when it comes to a professional setting, it can cause more harm than good. Typically, in an organization, when they consider promotions, in a leadership position, they typically consider men because men are stereotypically considered better leaders because they are considered better emotionally stable. However, that is absolutely not true. Now let's get to the difference between gender and sex, because many people get confused with the idea that the gender and sex are the same. Most of us have been raised with pretty simplistic ideas about sex and gender. Namely, there are only two sexes, male and female, and they align with the two genders, man and woman. However, is that true?
Yeah. I think it's important to further differentiate what gender and sex is. So sex is like the physical characteristics, right? And then gender, on the other hand, is how that's expressed. So masculinity versus femininity, and then assigning that to a specific gender is what gender is.
Science has made a lot of advancements in that respect, biological sex and gender, to realize that it is not a binary system. It is a spectrum. Sex assigned at birth is one thing. However, the gender identity and gender expression is a totally different thing. Regardless of how sex is assigned at the birth, how that person identifies as a particular gender is something that happens later on. Because typically the babies do not really identify with a gender. At certain age, they start identifying with a particular gender. And then they start expressing a particular gender characteristics. Typically, a person born with XY chromosome is identified as a male. A person born with the XX chromosome is identified as a female. Out of the 23 pairs of chromosomes in every cell of our body, it is that one pair that determines the sex. However, in the recent years, science has discovered that it is not just chromosomes that determine biological sex, especially the secondary sexual characteristics. There is a huge role for hormones to play in that. Obviously, hormones are expressions of genes. A person who is identified as a male will have a higher amount of male hormones, such as testosterone. Person who identified as a female at birth typically will have more of hormones such as estrogen and progesterone. So the hormone production, which is an expression of the genes, also contributes to the secondary sexual characteristics. It's not just the genitalia that determines a person's sex. There are other internal reproductive organs such as ovaries and testicles. So there are a lot of aspects that determines the sexual characteristics of a person. So we cannot always say that it's a binary. It is a non-binary, it is a spectrum. There are non-binary sexes, such as intersex individuals. There are about 1.7% of the population, which is 70 to 80 million people, which is more than half of the population of Russia. So we cannot ignore the people who are non-binary, who cannot be typically identified as a male or female. even medical science did not really understand how a person is born as an intersex individual. So in the early days, even the medical professionals recommended surgeries or sterilization and that kind of stuff.
Babies are born and they find out that the child is intersex, they are oftentimes subject to various unconsensual surgeries, such as irreversible sex assignment, involuntary sterilization, and involuntary genital normalizing surgery, which are performed without letting the parents choose and without the consent of the child, who's obviously having the surgery performed upon them. That sort of narrative about normalization of genitalia and stuff like that is like acting like there's something wrong with that intersex person, when in all actuality there's nothing wrong with them. Just varying outside of what the sex binary is and just being different from what's considered normal, I guess, doesn't mean that there's something wrong with that child. So even if that child grows up and they decide, I feel more comfortable if my body represented a woman, and then chose to move into that surgery, that would be completely fine. But I believe that performing unconsensual surgeries on children, babies, is horrific and just not okay. And it just shows how deeply ingrained this idea of a binary sex and this importance surrounding identifying to one of these binaries, identifying as specifically a man or a woman or male or female, even though despite how arbitrary it is and how much it doesn't matter, how important it is to our society, to the extent of which doctors will, without letting the parents know, will correct, quote unquote, an intersex baby's organs.
There is this syndrome called Turner syndrome, which is basically a condition in which a female is missing an X chromosome. A female person is supposed to have 2 X chromosomes, and there can be female people who are born with just 1 X chromosome. And this is not a small number actually. 1 in 2,000 girls born can have Turner syndrome. This is a totally random occurrence. There is no environmental or genetical reason for it. The problem with the people who have Turner syndrome, their ovaries don't produce estrogen or progesterone, and they have no periods. They have a lot of physical challenges. There is another syndrome called Klinefelter syndrome. This is basically 2 or more X chromosomes in a male. If a person is born as a male, typically they will have 1 X chromosome and 1 Y chromosome. People with the Klinefelter syndrome, they will have 2 or more X chromosomes, which means they are XYX or XYXX.
So if a male did have more than 1 X chromosome, would they still be considered a male, or would it just be addressed as intersex?
Yeah, they are typically considered as a male with this particular syndrome.
If that's the case, so their other physical characteristics would be male?
Yeah, they have most of the primary sexual characteristics of male, but their secondary sexual characteristics such as body hair, masculinity, voice, those things can be different.
What do you mean by masculinity?
The muscle mass.
Okay.
We tend to associate predominance of estrogen with the females and the predominance of testosterone with the males. However, it's important to understand that every person has both of these hormones. Who are identified as males can have some amount of estrogen. A female can have amounts of testosterone. In fact, it is important that they have those. For example, a form of estrogen is critical for sexual function in males. It is not only the fact that these hormones present in both the sexes, it is also important that they need them to properly function. So what it tells us that is, it is not a black and white binary situation. A person who is born as male can have different levels of male hormones, different levels of female hormones, and depending on that, their secondary sexual characteristics can be different. For example, not every male can have the same amount of facial hair. Some people have thick facial hair. Some people do not have thick facial hair. Some people have more of a deep bass voice, which is typically associated to male. Some people have more feeble voice, which is typically associated with females. So these all can vary depending on your hormonal activity in your body. So that is why it is important that we understand that it is not easy to put these two sexes in a mold and say that this is how the male sex should be behaving, this is how the female sex should be behaving.
I just wanted to talk about how damaging this idea is, that there's one way that males or men should act and there's one way that women or females should act. When it comes down to it, like you see it all through childhood, you see it through high school, middle school, elementary school. There are certain hobbies, there are certain activities that are pushed onto for this given example, I'll be referring to the male versus female, like within the binary. So boys are often told to go play with cars, go watch like superheroes, tractors, mess around, do sports, roughhouse, that sort of thing. And then when they diverge from that, when they express interest in things that are typically considered more feminine, they're harassed for it. They're bullied for it. They're attacked in a manner. Their sexuality is questioned. Their manhood is questioned. Their parents can hurt them when it comes to like very like staunch households, especially when homophobia runs rampant in today's world. And it just becomes extremely damaging because when you're told, like, for example, if a boy shows a sign of emotional vulnerability in terms of like crying, they're told to man up. They're trying to put that deep down inside of them. But when they express this same emotional vulnerability through a aggressive manner, this isn't corrected because it's considered normal. And that turns into an idea of toxic masculinity because now we've cemented this idea that aggression is okay to show in an emotional facet. So rather than healthily like cry about something, boys will often push it deep down inside of them until it comes out in an aggressive manner in which they can hurt other people. And this is just considered okay. And because aggression, as you said earlier, is a trait that's associated with masculinity.
And that can lead to depression, especially when the message they are receiving is, okay, if you're a boy, you need to toughen up, suck it up. That kind of message when you receive from your parents, your teachers, your people you associate with, that can completely put them in a situation where they are not able to open up and honestly talk about their feelings and emotions, and they bury everything down and eventually lead to depression.
A common argument for people who are most of the time very misogynistic, I'm just going to say people who identify as boys or men or males will typically say, okay, how come feminists never talk about men's mental health? Here's the issue that lies within that, right? Men's mental health is an issue. The rates of depression and suicide are very high for men. But now we have to question, why is this? Why are men so susceptible to suicide and depression and mental health, and they're expressing this through toxic manners? And why is it so much higher, right? But then in the same breath, they'll make fun of men who diverge from the socially constructed idea of cisgendered men. Men who wear nail polish, men who wear skirts, men who wear earrings, all of that things are criticized, especially the homophobia and how often homophobia leads to the death of people hurting themselves, people killing themselves, and that's not ever taken into consideration. So what we have to do now is diverge from this construct of what a man is. Because if you identify as a man, anything you do is masculine. Why do we have to take the most random things in the world and be like, this is a masculine thing, this is a feminine thing? Why does that matter? Why do we have to associate a gender to it? Or like the idea of it being associated to one gender over the other? It doesn't have to be. And it's only damaging when it is. Normalizing men expressing their emotion in a healthy manner, going to therapy, crying, relying on their friends, their partners, their family for emotional reliance. And it's so okay. It's so okay and it's normal to do and it helps a lot of people, but then it's criticized when men do it. And that would explain all of it, but that's often ignored and it just becomes another facet for people to criticize feminists.
We talked about biological sex. Biological sex is a spectrum. So we have male, female, and intersex. Now let's talk about gender. You already touched upon some non-binary gender expressions. So there is this gender identity and gender expression. Do you want to talk about what is a gender identity and how is it different from sex and how all these are different from gender expression?
Well, first of all, we have to get rid of the narrative that gender and sex is somehow connected. Because in all actuality, it really isn't. We have to think about how many of the things that are typically associated to men and women, are they really connected to being a female? Is something that a woman does really connected to being a female? Or is it something that was socially constructed and taught to the girl so they grew up with that information in mind being like, oh, I like this because I'm a girl. I like the color pink because I'm a girl. I like to play with dolls because I'm a girl. Is that really what a female would do? Or is that just something that was marketed to them through the media, through ads, through parents just getting gifts? The differentiation between gender and sex is that sex is a more biological aspect, while gender is just how you express not necessarily biological aspect, but how you express your masculinity, femininity, and everything in between, right? So gender identity comes down to what you identify as. So whether this be male or female or non-binary, existing outside of that binary, whether you identify as a man or a woman, or you identify as anything else. And then gender expression comes down to how you express this gender. For example, if you are a man, this gender expression could come through how you physically want to represent yourself. Well, this could be by wearing certain articles of clothing. This could be through different hairstyles. If you want to identify as a woman, then you'd wear more things that are typically considered feminine, like wearing dresses, skirts, certain colors, certain hairstyles, makeup. And then if you exist outside of that binary, then you'd express your gender in whatever manner makes you comfortable with that's associated to your gender identity. Oftentimes when someone is not necessarily non-binary, but typically when someone that exists without the binary and they want to be referred to as neither a man or a woman, they will go about in doing this through a manner which is considered androgynous, in which they don't want to be perceived as a man or a woman. They just want to be perceived as who they are and who they identify as.
Are they transgenders?
Okay, so here's the thing. I was very confused on this because when I first heard of transgender people, the only thing that came to mind was transitioning from a binary state of transgender. So transitioning from a man to a woman or transitioning from a woman to a man. But in all actuality, what transgender is transitioning outside of cisgender. So typically when you say
cisgender, that is the man-woman binary.
Yeah, the idea that if you are a male, you're a man. If you're a female, you're a woman. If you are cisgendered, you would identify with the gender that is associated with your sex. What transgender is that you're moving outside of that. So if you don't identify as what would be considered your cisgender, then you are transgender.
Let's talk about the physical characteristics of transgenders, or what we call third gender. Are these the people who feel as though they are in the wrong body, feel as though their body is biologically the wrong gender? Or these people have different secondary sexual characteristics such as facial hair, breast tissue, vocal range, etc.? Or are their both external and internal reproductive system is different?
This all depends on what your idea of transgender is. If you're talking about transgender within the binary from going man to a woman, then as I understand it, it can be like if I was born in the body of a male or had male characteristics, the genitalia of a man, and I am a woman in all actuality, and I would feel more comfortable with having the characteristics of a woman. So this could be through hormone therapy, going through sex change surgery is what it's called. But it also could be through how I present myself. So if I'm a woman and I want to be perceived as a woman, but I have this typical defining characteristics of a man, then that could be playing into the binary and wearing certain things to be perceived in a certain manner. But then also we have to separate the idea of genitalia equaling gender, right? Having this a misconception that non-binary people need to look a certain way. They have to look androgynous to be perceived as non-binary, when in reality, you don't have to do anything different to be perceived as non-binary. If you are non-binary, you are non-binary. If I identified as a non-binary individual, I wouldn't have to change a single thing about myself. I wouldn't have to make myself more androgynous or make myself look more masculine or somewhere in between to be perceived as non-binary. Because we have this stereotype built into our head that how you look is equal to your gender.
And there is also this argument that gender is in the brain. People say that what determines sex is how you should express your gender. Anything else you feel, how most of the third gender people feel, that they feel as though their body is biologically the wrong gender. People just dismiss that, saying that it's only in your head.
Yeah, but I feel like you could break that down into everything is in your head.
Even if it is in your head, should we dismiss it?
Absolutely not. For example, if I was in school and I'm like, I want to be a doctor. If a teacher was like, that's all in your head, you're actually supposed to be an artist. Like, you can't be anything outside of an artist. You are an artist. But I want to be a doctor. That doesn't make any sense, just to say it's all in my head.
Historically, how people believed about sex and gender. it evolved. For example, Aristotle believed incorrectly that the sex of an infant is determined by how much heat a man's sperm had during insemination. That is insane, right?
Yeah.
So over like literally hundreds and thousands of years, science has made a lot of advancement, shedding light into how these systems are more complex than we originally thought. I think religion also played a huge role in causing a lot of misunderstandings about sex and gender. For example, most of the religions recognize only two sexes, male and female, right? In Bible it says God created a man and woman. And most of the Christian denominations consider people like transgenders and third genders as sinful people. They see them as morally unacceptable. In fact, in Bible, specifically in Torah, which is the Jewish text, the Old Testament, which contains prohibitions against men wearing women's clothing and vice versa. So cross-dressing was prohibited. It was considered sinful. So there are a lot of misconceptions both in religious texts and history that is still driving people to believe this binary system of sex determination and gender expression. However, that is absolutely not true. And when in doubt, we need to look at data and we need to look at science to get our questions answered.
I wanted to talk a little bit about gender as a social construct. So first, to define a social construct is something that does not exist in objective reality, but rather has been constructed by humans and is subjected to change based on human nature and actions. So when we talk about gender in this narrative, we're talking about what defines a man and what defines a woman, and how has this changed? As a social construct, there has been changes to what is typically considered characteristics of a man and characteristics of a woman. For example, while now wearing skirts and dresses and stuff of those manners are considered feminine, in many ancient empires, wearing things that closely resemble skirts and dresses were worn by men all the time, just for comfort, just because it was what they wore. And it wasn't looked at in a weird way. And it would be so strange for you to look upon those people and be like, yeah, your masculinity is less now. You're less of a man because you're wearing something that looks like a dress. And I think that's weird.
Let me ask you a question. I mean, we may not have an answer to this. At what age should a child be able to decide their gender? Just how much of our gender is biologically determined? How much of our gender role is determined by the society?
I'd like to rebuttal that question by saying, why is it important that we have a definite grasp on what our gender is? As of recent, I've come to conflations about my own gender identity because I no longer completely identify with being a girl, and I think that's perfectly fine. But as of now, I still identify as a girl because I haven't fully come to terms or a full understanding of what gender identity I would be most comfortable with. I think it's strange that we place so much importance on having a definite grasp of being like, I am a man or I am a woman. Children don't need a deadline for identifying as a certain thing. Just let children exist as they are, and as they grow, they can identify as whatever makes them the happiest with themselves. So since gender is a social construct, it is completely determined by social norms. I think that to conflate gender identity with biological aspects in any manner is just misinformed because there is no connection. Obviously, there are things that are considered more feminine and more masculine, and those things are connected to being a female or a male. But is this really something that's a scientific connection? Or is this a social construction and just pushed upon us as children so that we just grow into them?
I want to differentiate one other aspect in this conversation because this is related, that the sexual orientation is totally different. It's a totally different topic. Mm-hmm. It has nothing to do with biological sex or the sex identified at birth or gender identity or gender expression. Sexual orientation has very little to do with our gender identity. It's solely about who you are attracted to, yes, sexually and romantically. People of all gender identities may identify as straight or as somewhere in the LGBTQ plus spectrum. So I just wanted to make sure that we are not mixing that with today's discussion.
Yeah, it's conflated all the time. There's so many misconceptions about sexual orientation and gender identity being confused and like tangled where they should not be.
Let's talk about gender politics. Lately, I see this trend in Twitter and various social medias that people are using pronouns more and more. So when they create their profile in Twitter, for example, they say that he, him, or she, her. Is that causing more confusion than before? What's your take on that?
I think, if anything, it causes less confusion because obviously we have this, it exists within almost every individual. We have these certain implications about how you look being connected to your gender. For example, if I looked at you right now, I would say you are a man. But if you identified as something other than that, unless you told me, I would not know. So putting our pronouns in our bio, while pronouns are not directly related to gender, if I want to leave a comment on someone's post who identifies as non-binary and uses they, them pronouns, if I said, wow, she looks really pretty today, it would be very harmful to that individual and very damaging to their identity. If instead I looked at their bio as like, oh, they use they, them pronouns, I would be able to say, wow, they look really great. And it's just very like, no, I wouldn't want to say like validating, but it's just correct, right? So knowing that would help you communicate with other individuals. And it can also help for someone who I did not know what non-binary was. I didn't understand the use of they, them pronouns until like maybe 3-4 years ago. And a lot of people are only getting used to it now. Like on TikTok all the time I'm seeing, how are you going to be referred to as plural? Just the idea that they is connected to plural. However, it's not. So just getting used to that and seeing that more and more can cement in your head that, okay, when addressing a person who uses they, them pronouns, I have to speak in this manner. This is how I would say it. I think it's very helpful overall.
The language is also evolving. Our vocabulary is evolving. Traditionally, we probably didn't have the vocabulary to address a non-binary person. And we may have to evolve our language to support these new discoveries science is making.
I wouldn't necessarily we didn't have the vocabulary. It just wasn't used as much. For example, let's say someone leaves their coat and you don't know the gender of the person or the pronouns that this person uses. And you can't really tell from the coat. Obviously, I'm playing into the binary a little bit here, but you would say, oh no, someone left their coat. You wouldn't say, oh, someone left her coat, because you don't know who the person is. So we do have the vocabulary to use it. We're just not used to it yet. So I think once again, this idea of normalizing putting pronouns in your bio is very helpful to this entire movement.
So why are we talking about all this? Okay, so why is this a big deal? Why is pronouns a big deal? Why is identifying the person with the gender that they want to associate with is a big deal? Are there any implications in their life? Are we denying some fundamental rights? Are we denying them access to healthcare, basic necessities, such as public bathrooms, locker rooms, etc.? In fact, let's talk about this issue of using public bathrooms. Typically, if you go to any place, you have a bathroom for men, bathroom for women. Traditionally, we built a lot of institutions, a lot of infrastructure which supports this binary idea of male, female, sex, and man, woman, gender. However, now we are discovering that is not the case and it's not supporting with how we traditionally thought. How do you fix that?
So I think that the best way to go about this is just implementing unisex bathrooms everywhere. I was actually watching a TED Talk on this earlier today. I forgot their name, but this person was non-binary. And although biologically they were female, the way that they expressed themselves it was in a more masculine manner. So they didn't really feel comfortable with using a man's bathroom or a woman's bathroom. And every time they would go into a woman's bathroom, because biologically they were female, they would get looks, they would get stares, they would just hear obscene comments about them being in that bathroom. If we implemented unisex bathrooms where anyone could use the bathroom there, I just feel like it would make people who don't adhere to the gender binary more comfortable, allow them to relieve themselves without hearing remarks about who they are and just like things that aren't really anyone else's business.
In India, there was this community of people called hijras. They typically, you will see them in India, Pakistan, and a lot of South Asia. I have seen them in my life when I grew up in India. These communities have considered over generations who are basically living in poverty. They are basically transgenders.
All of them?
Yeah.
Everyone's transgender?
Yeah. Or at least they did not identify themselves with the traditional gender definitions.
Okay.
When they were born, they are born with a particular genitals. However, they started feeling like they are in the wrong body and they started expressing their gender in the opposite way of how they were assigned sex at the birth. Mm-hmm. And they were thrown out of their houses. Not only just their homes, their communities. So they had nowhere to go. They were basically living in the street. Obviously, nobody offered them jobs. Nobody offered them education. Most of them work as sex workers for survival. The government even did not intervene up until 2014. There were no legal rights for transgender people in India until 2014. In fact, that's when they recognized the third gender in the legal system. Nobody gave them housing. So if you approach a landlord for renting an apartment or renting a house, these people were considered outcasts. So they did not get any access to housing. They did not get access to healthcare. Access to healthcare is important because a lot of these people work as sex workers. Obviously, they had a higher rate of HIV infection. In fact, 27% of the Hijra community were infected with HIV virus. In many countries, sexuality other than male and female are criminalized. In India, the Supreme Court actually recriminalized homosexual sex in 2013, which means that there was a sharp increase in physical, psychological, and sexual violence against transgender communities by police, by law enforcement, by general public. They all abused these people because they didn't have a legal system to protect them. The other aspect is the access to education and employment. Even if they get access to educational institutions and employment, they were discriminated because they didn't look right, they didn't dress right with the stereotypical way of how the society defined how people should be dressing and expressing themselves. They also had issues with immigration because most of the immigration law prohibited transgenders to be immigrated to other countries. So there are a lot of issues the people who do not identify with male or female genders faced. And this is why we want to talk about it. You solve a problem by making it big. It is important that we talk about it. It's important that we make this mainstream. And now things are changing all over the world. In India, in the last 10-20 years, government and a lot of non-profit organizations are empowering the transgender communities, the Hijra communities. So let's talk about how we can abolish the whole idea of discriminating people on the basis of gender. Do you support abolishing the idea of gender from society? Or is it okay that people have some kind of gender expression, however, evolve the society to a point where we are not discriminating against them?
A very important distinction that we have to make is with gender abolishment does not mean that people who exist within the binary, who do identify as a man or a woman, are any less valid. While this has been implemented into them societally, there is nothing wrong with identifying as a man or a woman. It's just the implications of what a man or a woman is, which is damaging. So I would like to move into a place societally where nothing is gendered. You can act in every facet imaginable as what is stereotypically considered feminine or considered being like a woman, and it doesn't have to be gendered, because ultimately, why do we have to gender it? Why is nail polish considered a feminine thing? Why is playing football considered a masculine thing? We are just gendering things unnecessarily, and that's just super damaging to people. And I think that without this idea of a gender binary, I think we would live in a better place.
I think it was a very interesting conversation. I learned a lot by studying this topic. I didn't know a lot of things. I know that this conversation has been going on in our society for a long time. There have been a lot of people who lived under fear, who were not ready to come out, and who did not live to their true self. And now we are moving into a more progressive outlook in our society where people can fearlessly express themselves without the fear of judgment.
I think we definitely have a long way to go. I think it's important to realize that it's normal for people to come out now, it's safe for everyone, is a misconception, because as we live in America, it can be safer, but we have to think about people are being hate crimed and discriminated against, especially, I don't know the exact statistic, but the homicide rate for Black transgender females is absolutely insane. And in third world countries and countries where it's not even close to how acceptable it may be in a first world country such as America, it's even worse for sure. So we have a long way to go, but I think that slowly, a little by little, we are moving into that
Are you hopeful?
state. Yeah, I'm definitely hopeful, because I wasn't aware about a lot of these issues even a few years back. And I think that by just informing people and helping people understand the misconceptions that we have held for so long and helping people be more progressive and more accepting, I think that we can move into a better place.
That is very well said.